So welcome again, Father Kevin, who is Ordinary Professor of the History of Ancient Philosophy and former Dean of Philosophy at the Gregorian University in Rome. Father Kevin is the author of many publications, including Acts and Precepts, and his recent book on cooperation with evil. He'll be speaking to us on conscience, human rights, and synderesis. So thank you very much, Father Kevin.
Okay. It's good to be here, and thanks for the invitation. And let me first say something about the paper itself. It's based on some research I've been doing for an article which will be published by one of these handbooks. It's called the Cambridge Handbook of Natural Law and Human Rights. And but it's still in the process of being written. So there's some of it written, some of it's still to be written. And actually that title was given to me by the editors itself. So that's in the article itself. In fact, I'll go into a lot of the etymology having to do with these concepts, especially in particular the concept of conscience and synderesis. And in fact, when the editors gave me the title for the talk, they specified that it would be, in fact, they specified the word conscientia, not conscience, and synderesis. So the title they gave me was actually Synderesis, Conscientia, and Human Rights. And that's a bit that's important in a certain sense, because the concept of conscientia in the various people that I'll look at isn't exactly what we regard as conscience. So it has more to do simply with knowledge or shared knowledge in general, not necessarily what we would regard as conscience, and certainly not personal conscience. And synderesis is another term which is not often used nowadays, but I think that's regrettable, because it's very solidly inserted into the tradition, as I'll be explaining, and it's very useful for solving certain problems about conscience and what we call conscience. And the reason for that is that, often when we talk about conscience, the church will state very clearly that we're not talking about personal conscience, that is an individual's understanding of what's the right thing to do, but rather a conscience which is informed. And that solves some of the problems that arise, but what synderesis does, especially when it's understood the way that Thomas Aquinas understood it, is it puts the basis of conscience or conscientia in nature itself, and so it's not something that we have to, at least to some extent, it's not something that we have to learn, but it's something that's innate in us. And anyhow, well, I'll be talking a bit about that later. In terms of the word of synderesis, obviously it's a Greek word. There's a lot of debate about just exactly what the origins of the word are, and but I argue basically that is even though there is some ambiguity early on about what exactly the etymology might be, that by the time we get into the Christian era, that it's pretty clear what it means, and it's used fairly consistently, and it means basically the preservation of something, and it could mean, so the teresis would be the kind of holding on to something, and the word, the prefix that sum is a bit ambiguous. It could mean that these are things that are held on, that one holds on to together with someone else, or it could simply be a way of emphasizing the word holding. And but anyhow, there's a large section on the etymology, and I won't go into that. there's also obviously there's one of the issues, one of the themes is rights, and my argument is ultimately that what we need to do is adhere more to Thomas Aquinas's understanding of these matters, and consider rights, at least in the first instance, as objective, and as opposed to subjective. And in effect, in the paper, I identify or equate kind of subjective rights with a sort of personalistic understanding of rights. And I think in most of the reading that I've been doing recently on rights, and there are all sorts of material out there right now, people are very unsatisfied with the use that is made of the term right and rights, simply because we end up with a good number of rights which contradict one another. So I mean, we can simply think of someone claiming a right to abortion, and which seems to imply that in any case one has to grant that right, but then others will object to actually performing abortions and things like that. But anyway, I'm sure any number of subjective rights which do come into contradiction with one another. And my argument, as you'll see later, is that the idea of objective rights, especially as it's found in Thomas Aquinas, helps us past some of these ideas or some of these problems, at least as a general approach. Oh, that's right. I want to share this screen here. Let's see here. So I hope you can see that all, you all. And
yeah, we can see it.
Okay. And so basically, this is what I'm going to do, is that I'm going to first of all consider Saint Jerome, who's pretty much, not entirely, but pretty much the first person in the Christian tradition to talk about synderesis. And certainly, other scholars kind of look back at Jerome, and when they talk about synderesis and conscience and things like that. And then I'll go on to talk about Peter Lombard. I'll say just a few things about Peter Lombard. There'll be more in the paper. And also about Philip the Chancellor, who's not especially well known. He was as we'll see, he was the dean of the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris, and therefore had a certain amount of not unchallenged authority within the University of Paris. And he's an interesting person just for understanding the context, the political and theological, philosophical context in which Thomas Aquinas eventually wrote. And then finally, I'll look at what Thomas says. So let me start with Jerome. So I found that picture of Jerome. There's a nice picture of Jerome. And basically, the important thing in Jerome is his commentary on a passage right at the beginning of the book of Ezekiel. And I'll read the passage. He says, he speaks there of 4 animals in human form. Each had 4 faces, each had 4 wings. Their feet were straight feet, and the soles of their feet was like the soles of calf's foot, and they sparkled. That's the important thing. Sparkled like the appearance of glowing brass. So that passage is subject to a number of interpretations by Jerome himself. And he first of all talks about the 4 faces and associates them with the various evangelists. So Matthew would be the man, Mark would be a lion, and Luke would be a calf, and finally John would be an eagle. So he simply says that we can interpret those words in Ezekiel in those terms, that it's it's kind of looking forward to the 4 Gospels. And then he also talks about certain people, and in fact, it's a bit frustrating, but he says there are certain people who try to associate those four individuals with the Platonic parts of the soul, and so this is basically it. So you've got Matthew, who's the man, Mark the lion, Luke the calf, John the eagle, but then this crowd who's not named, and in fact he uses the Greek terms. The man is associated with the logikon, or the rational part, the lion with the thumikon, which would be the aggressive part of the soul, and the calf with the epithumetikon, which would be the desiring part of the soul. And then he associates John the eagle with Synderesis, which is the term which eventually becomes Synderesis. And he also speaks of that as scintilla conscientiae, which is basically the spark of conscience. And one problem here that even he acknowledges, well, it's not really a problem, but he acknowledges that in Plato, and this is purports to be to some extent an interpretation of Plato, there are only three parts of the soul. So he suggests that the fourth part, that is Synderesis, or the scintilla conscientiae, is actually above the soul as understood by Plato, and in fact as understood by the people that propose this. And
sorry, Professor, but I guess your slideshow doesn't move. I mean, are you? Because we still see the first slide.
Oh, really? No,
yes.
On my screen, it's moving.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, that's strange.
That's really strange. Yes.
Well,
I
Ilaria,
can see an hourglass, so it looks like it might be like frozen or.
Yeah,
like...
it looks frozen. Maybe you can unshare and share again.
Okay, I'll stop the share and then share it again. Where is it now?
Okay, now we see your first slide, but now, yes, perfect. It's working right now.
Oh, okay.
Yes. Okay.
Okay.
Sorry.
So I won't reread Ezekiel, but the idea. Can you see that?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Perfect.
So you got the three parts: logikon, thumikon, and epithumetikon, and those are the Platonic parts of the soul. And then this crowd, whom he doesn't identify, add in Synderesis or Synderesis, and which he identifies as the scintilla conscientiae, which is basically the spark of conscience. And according to even according to Jerome, the spark of conscience is distinct from conscience itself, and so it's the basis of conscience, and or conscientia, as I actually prefer to say it. One thing that he does also say is that in that context is that conscientia or conscience can in fact be deceived, and it becomes deceived when it's mixed up with deceptive reason, and but he also says that Synderesis is not deceived, so it's the basis of conscience. And all this actually has to do, in fact, in the paper, actually an earlier version of the paper, I actually cut it out, but it does actually have a bearing upon Christology. So it has to do with the question of whether Jesus Christ could have become man or a human being, and the reason that that's an issue is that at least certain people like Maximus Confessor argue that no, there has to have been something like Synderesis in human nature. Otherwise, Christ becoming man would have been to become partly evil. So so there has to be something basic in man that is as created, that's not corrupt. And anyhow, but that's something which eventually I just kind of left out of the paper, but it's interesting nonetheless. I'll probably go into that in further work. Okay, so let me say something about Peter Lombard, and let me also just take my watch off so I got some idea of the time here. So anyhow, Lombard is the next figure in the argument, and Lombard actually doesn't use the term Synderesis, which is interesting. Although he talks about Jerome and he uses the term scintilla, etc., and he's clearly talking about the same idea, but he doesn't use the term Synderesis, as I said, and nonetheless, it's because of, at least I argue, it's because of Lombard that the term Synderesis comes into the tradition. So after Lombard, you find it constantly in the commentators and philosophers and theologians. And I think probably what went on there is that people were reading Lombard. Everyone had to read Lombard, and reading Lombard, they were immediately taken to Jerome, and they saw that Jerome was using the term Synderesis. So it actually entered into that tradition. Another interesting thing is that when Lombard talks about Jerome, he uses a phrase which is not exactly the phrase that Jerome uses, and you can see that in the screen. That is, he uses the term scintilla rationis. So it's very clearly associated with reason, but it's the scintilla of rationis. So it's the scintilla that is the spark of reason, and that in fact is consistent with what we'll see in Thomas Aquinas. Is that Thomas too is very inclined to associate, especially conscience, with reason itself. And I must say also, however, that Lombard, although he does speak in this passage, which I won't read, although he does speak of reason, and he speaks of the higher spark of reason, he tends rather to associate Synderesis not with reason or anything associated with reason, but rather with the will, and that's quite different from what we'll see later in Thomas Aquinas. And I think it's anyhow. My argument is that Thomas very much associates both conscientia, that is conscience, and Synderesis with the intellect, or at least with reason and the intellect, and that is what allows him to have a more objective understanding of rights itself. And if you base everything in the will, you do tend to bring things towards the subjective. That is, what any individual has a will, but our will is much more closely associated with the person rather than with objective reality. But as soon as when you introduce intellect and reason, etc., then you're brought into a more objective way of considering things. Anyhow, so Lombard is not entirely clear or consistent in my mind. So the next figure is Philip the Chancellor, and I mentioned that he was the dean of Notre Dame. I couldn't find a picture of him, so I just give you the picture of Notre Dame Cathedral there, and apparently, from what research I've done, he had a certain authority over the University of Paris, but it was much challenged, and I think you tend to see this even in his remarks, and if Lombard was a bit ambiguous in what he would say about various things, the various concepts that are involved here. Philip the Chancellor is even more ambiguous, and I think what we see here is something kind of a characteristic of a university administrator, someone that doesn't want to offend anyone. So he'll say one thing, and then he'll qualify it, and in fact sometimes even contradict himself. And obviously I'm just talking about these concepts in having to do with Synderesis. So let me just this is a passage which can be found in his work, the only full work that we have of his, which is the Summa de Bono, and he's got a section there which is on Synderesis, and I just kind of highlighted a couple of some of the ideas or the concepts that he associates with Synderesis. Sometimes he actually associates it with a power, and then sometimes he says, or it may actually be a connatural habit. Okay, and habit, in fact, is what Thomas eventually kind of grabs onto. So he says that Synderesis is a habit, but a habit, not the sort of thing that we have when we acquire virtues, but again, it's something which is innate. So, and in that way, it's very, very much associated with Aristotle's idea of a habit or a hexis, which is simply a having. So a having doesn't necessarily entail that it's the product of habituation or of an acquired habit. And although we'll see a bit later that there is some qualification to be put even on that. Okay. Another thing, sometimes he associates it with either free will or reason. And again, Thomas eventually will prefer reason rather than free will. And again, you can see that I highlighted again the word power. The power of the soul would in fact be the will. That's what he has in mind. And finally, he also in that same passage he asks whether Synderesis can be extinguished in such a way that it does not murmur back at sin. And so I just find that an interesting concept. Is that's what conscience does? Is that it just kind of sorry, I said that's what Synderesis does. So when your conscience, that is your knowledge of what you ought to do, goes wrong, there's something within you which murmurs back. But again, it's very important that this is something within you, and rather than something which is which you would learn from external teachers. Okay. Let me say a couple other things about Philip. He also says, he uses some interesting terms. He says that that conscience is flexibile. That's the word he uses, flexible. So that's the reason why it can go wrong. But Synderesis is inflexible. It's inflex. It doesn't flex. And he's also very much in favor of Jerome's understanding of Synderesis as something beyond the three powers of the soul as understood by Plato. And eventually he says one of the phrases that he uses when he's talking about Synderesis, he finally says, he says, well, he says the question is, okay, is it a power of the soul or is it a habit? And he just equivocates and really says, well, it's an habitual power. And so this is, and really I interpret this as it helps us to understand, as I said, the context within which Thomas was writing and deliberating about these ideas. So that's well, yeah, we'll just pass on to Thomas now. So this is a picture that it's actually it's a painting which is in the Vatican museums up on the ceiling. It's not often seen, but you have to look up at the ceiling, and it's really quite quite beautiful, and to my mind, but it's also interesting, and so what you have there is Thomas Aquinas offering his writings to the church. The church is the woman at the top, and not down below, looking in the other direction, looking in our direction, is Aristotle himself, and it's almost as if Aristotle is saying, well, Thomas, you've tried to understand it, but just read this and you'll understand it better, and that's and actually, I've read somewhere that the reason that Thomas is looking towards the church and Aristotle is not looking towards the church is that the idea is that Aristotle did not have access to revelation, that is direct revelation, and but obviously in some sense, he's involved, and so anyhow, I always like that picture. Okay, so what Thomas says here is that again, he distinguishes synderesis and conscience very clearly, and he associates conscience with very clearly also with knowledge, and but one of the very interesting things is that he identifies, he equates in any number of places that synderesis with what he calls the judicatorium naturale, that is the natural seat of justice, and that's a very, very important clue, or kind of statement or approach, and obviously the word judicatorium contains the word the just, or jus, and which indicates, and when Thomas talks about this, he just constantly refers to Aristotle and the Nicomachean Ethics, Book 5, and in particular the idea that the jus is equality, but is equality understood in a very, very general way. So Aristotle does in fact talk about kind of a just exchange, so you give something which has a certain value in order to purchase other things which have a proportionate value, but if the thing that you give is less valuable than the thing that you get, well, then you have to supplement it with other goods, so that eventually equality is established. Okay, so that's in general what Aristotle talks about that, but there's also a passage in which he really expands the idea of equality greatly, and so he says that at one point that when someone is injured, like struck or something like that, and the other person is punished. So what that sort of thing, what that sort of adjustment does is it reestablishes a sort of equality. So the whole idea is that the just will be reestablished, and no one will have more of anything more than what he really ought to have. But again, it's understood very, very broadly. And then the next words are actually mine. It's just a sentence that I wrote. So, but it's just, it's based on Thomas. I have to kind of look. So it's in Secunda 5071. And so he says this. He says this, or I say this emphasis on equality or jus as its object, and that's very important. Objective, makes justice quite distinct from the other moral virtues, such as courage and temperance. And this is Aristotle's position, but also Thomas's. And they, that is the moral virtues, courage, temperance, etc., have primarily to do with the internal qualities of the agent, that is, with the person, with the subjective. So when you talk about temperance, it's about whether he goes towards the mean and does not want, either excess or a lack of goods to consume. So anyhow, they have those other moral virtues have to do with the internal qualities of the agent, and but justice has primarily, not solely, but primarily to do with establishing jus, its object, and that object is objective. It's outside of us. There's a passage in Cajetan where he explains what Thomas is talking about there, what he has in mind, and it's it's in the standard Leonine edition of the Summa, and which has all the commentaries by, or many of the commentaries by Cajetan, maybe all, I'm not sure. Cajetan explains it this way. He says that another might undo, and what he's doing is explaining why it is that use is objective. And he says that another might undo or corrumpere an equalizing constituted by me, as is apparent when I have ordered that his field be restored to John, and another orders that the same field be taken from him. He has undone the equalizing which I brought about. So again, Cajetan suggests that that's shows us that it's that use is the object of justice, and object in the objective sense. And I think that we might also say, that independently of me, for instance, a third person might come along in that same situation and restore the equality done by the person who orders that John's field be taken from him. So in other words, now we've got another person, and what is the just, doesn't have anything directly to do with me, but with the situation in the world. So, but there's also another point which he makes when he's talking about Synderesis, and it has to do with the idea that that Synderesis is something which is immobile, and this in fact goes against what we saw in Jerome and others when they talk about the scintilla. So a scintilla is a spark. Sometimes even it can be translated a sparkling. And Thomas doesn't want anything which moves around like that. So that brings it too close to the will as well. And so he wants something which is quite flat, in fact, still and unmoving. So I'll read some of these passages. What he says. He says, every motion proceeds from an immobile mover, that is, from the intellect, which possesses a certain uniformity and quiet. And he wants to say that Synderesis is like that. And then, just as in speculative matters, reasoning depends upon principles that are known per se, and then this quote, the habit of which principles is called intellect, so also practical reason depends upon principles that are known per se, such as that evil is not to be done, that the precepts of God are to be obeyed, and so forth. Okay, so basically there he's talking about Synderesis, the habit of Synderesis, and what is contained in Synderesis. And it's very interesting that that he uses that phrase that it says one of the per se principles, immovable principles, is that evil is not to be done. The reason that that's interesting and important is that he's referring there to what's known in Thomas as the first principle of practical reason, but which in Aristotle is simply a practical version of the principle of non-contradiction. And that what that shows us is that when Thomas, is kind of looking at rights and rights as objective, that is the jus, that is the right as objective, what he's looking for primarily, and which what Synderesis is going to try to ensure is that there not be contradictions in that objective situation. And so, in other words, when we identify, when we talk about rights, that our understanding of rights does not involve contradiction and practical contradiction, of course, but in Aristotle, followed by Thomas Aquinas, there is such a thing as contradiction in the practical sphere. I might also mention, this comes in the next bit there. He says that the habit of these, so again, he uses the word habit, is synderesis, that is the habit of those principles. And then he says, which is in a way, quodam modo, innate to our mind by means the very light of the agent intellect. Okay, the reason why he says it's only in a way innate in our minds is that he does acknowledge that in order to, that synderesis does receive something from outside. So in fact, he says that it depends, we are indebted for the principles on sense and memory. So they're not, they come immediately when we have any sort of sense or memory. And, but again, even synderesis, as objective as it is and still, quiet, still depends to some extent on something coming in from the outside. And again, but that's consistent with the idea that jus is something external. It's not something which is personal. So the last slide is basically just that statement in the Metaphysics of Aristotle, the fourth book, in which he talks about the practical principle of non-contradiction. And I'll just read it. And so he says, but if all are alike, both right and wrong, one who believes this can neither speak nor say anything intelligible. For he says at the same time both yes and no. So again, he's trying to get rid of contradictions in the practical sphere. And then he goes, he says, for why does a man walk to Megara and not stay at home, thinking he ought not to walk? If it makes no difference, whether you go or whether you don't. And why does he not walk early some morning into a well or over a precipice if one happens to be in his way? Why do we observe him guarding against this, evidently not thinking that falling in is alike good and not good? So anyhow, the point is simply that Aristotle and Thomas both recognize that there is principle of non-contradiction which pertains to the practical reason. That's all I have to say. Maybe I'll close this sharing screen now. Okay.
Well, thank you very much, Father Kevin, your rich presentation. Would anyone like to make a comment initially or ask a question?
I might put some headphones on because it'll help me to hear the question.
Of course, yes.
Okay.
If anyone would prefer to make a comment in the chat, then feel free to do that. For example, if your connection's not very good, otherwise either physically raise your hand or do the little hand raise. Jason, you have a question.
Yeah, thank you very much, Father Kevin. That was really insightful. And I definitely appreciate what I wasn't particularly aware of, which was, the sort of linguistic basis of all this, and the early treatments with Jerome and so on. You talked about with Thomas, the sort of immobility of conscience, right, is the starting point. But of course, conscience has to be informed, right? And so one of the things I've always struggled with, right, is like Synderesis is supposed to be this this power to understand the the light of the natural law, right? By the light of reason, and of course, natural law is itself unchanging, immovable. So should this capacity for us to understand. But then the actualization of that in conscientia, right, is something that isn't innate or so on, right? It gets formed and so on. Yeah, and it can go wrong. So I guess my question is, the epistemic issue of how do I know subjectively, conscience is not subjective in the way that you specified, but how do I know when my conscience is has reached immobility, right? Has reached that state of certainty in my actualization of my knowledge of natural law?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah. Let me just say this, actually a preliminary point is that I find, he has that passage or that line which I quoted, in which he suggests that basically what you have in Synderesis is the practical first principle, and also kind of obey the commandments of God and other things. So he's extremely vague on that exactly, about what exactly comes into Synderesis, and I haven't been able to find anything which kind of adds anything more particular to it. And I think I'm inclined to say that okay, Synderesis is basically the most basic per se principles of ethics, and other things are going to be added onto it, but they're going to be added onto it in a way in connection with Synderesis. So Synderesis is going to be the basis of even other ideas that will come in regarding rights. And I also think that, like, for instance, that Thomas, and I think certainly Aristotle would be more than willing to say that different states, in fact, may kind of recognize different rights, and even when you get farther and farther from the principles that it just often kind of what is the just and good thing to do simply depends on what the law is in that particular state. And so anyhow, but so in answer to your question, I hope I recall it fairly well now, but it is I think it has to do, one comes to realize that one's conscience is in good order when there's more peace. So when there's not that kind of murmuring back of Synderesis. And does that satisfy you at all?
Well, I mean, it does, in the sense that at least I can be in this state where again, I have this kind of quiescence in my own mind and heart that what I'm doing is right. But then, of course, I could be objectively wrong in what I'm doing, right? And it shouldn't be. I mean, that's a problem, right? I guess there's a problem, and I'll defer to Matt and his question next. But I just feel like there's this problem where our actualization of conscience can kind of tamp down that the synderetical murmuring to a point where we're not recognizing the good anymore that we ought to. And it seems like it should never get to that point, but it seems subjectively like it can and does with a lot of people.
Yeah, yeah. You know, it just seems to me that he would want to say that, well, you know, I think there is a passage in which he does, you know, talk about this issue. I think it's in Thomas, and in which he acknowledges that it can be, you know, kind of synderesis can be so abused that it's, you know, the murmuring is extremely minimal. But I must say, I wrote a whole book on, you know, kind of on Aristotle's you know, kind of moral theory, a lot of it having to do with this, you know, what he says about, you know, the akrasia, you know, the weak-willed man, et cetera, et cetera. And when he talks about, when Aristotle eventually talks about the person that's absolutely corrupt, that akalastos is the term they uses. I could never find Aristotle actually saying that he's gonna, one of the problems with the person who is absolutely corrupt is that he seems to be almost as confident as the person who's absolutely virtuous. So the person that's absolutely virtuous is, you know, has a tranquil, you know, tranquil soul, but what really causes trouble is that when you know is the akrates, the person that's weak of will, and the akrates thinks that he knows what he ought to do, but he doesn't do it, and then there's a contradiction in his soul, and Aristotle says that very clearly, and he talks about another number of other, you know, kind of related types of person, and they too have, you know, kind of struggles within. But then when he comes to the akalastos, person who's absolutely corrupt, he never says this, but it seems as if he would. Ironically, he has kind of the same sort of, you know, kind of unified. It sometimes seems as if he has the same kind of unified soul that the virtuous man has. But I argue in the book that that in fact there has to be something which just doesn't sit right even with that guy, but it's so deep-seated, you know, and basically what I'm saying, you know, based on what this paper is about, is that would have to do with synderesis itself and the very essence of the person. So the essence of the person wants to have coherence, and he may kind of delight in a nasty sort of way in contradictions, but there's something in our nature which doesn't like that, you know, that so anyway, these are just kind of my ramblings there, Jason, sorry.
No, thank you, Father.
Okay.
Matthew.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
So I have a question. So in the summer, Aquinas talks, when he's talking about synderesis, he refers back to Augustine about the natural power of judgment being unchangeable. And he seems to agree with Augustine now that it is unchangeable, but then he dissents from Augustine in that he says Augustine seems to equate reason and synderesis, and he doesn't want to equate them in quite the same way. And I guess my question is the motivation behind that for Aquinas to preserve the objectivity of synderesis? Is his concern there that if it's not unchangeable, then it becomes subjective, and he wants to get away from that in much the same way he wants to get away from the will?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think that the reason he goes for habit as you know, as for synderesis as a habit is so that, and a habit of the intellect is precisely because that habit of the intellect is oriented towards that which is objectively just, yeah, and solid, yeah. I'm not sure, I didn't, what passage are you talking about? Because I didn't realize that Augustine actually used the word synderesis.
So the passage that Aquinas refers back to is it's De Libero Arbitrio, and it's Article 10. No, is it Article 10?
Okay.
210. So he refers back to Augustine, but I've not seen the primary source in Augustine.
Yeah, but I don't doubt. In fact, I mean, there are a lot of people that, yeah, I mean, one instance would be Maximus Confessor, who doesn't use the term synderesis, but in fact, he's talking about it all the time. So,
yeah.
But thanks for the reference, and I'll look it up just to see what. But I hope I hope I understood your question. But I think, yeah, I mean, he's always concerned with kind of consistency and there's even a place where he talks about synderesis as a tabula rasa, kind of a blank slate, and but then he also, and as I mentioned, that he thinks that the first thing that comes into synderesis are those two principles that he mentioned. So
yeah. Okay, thank you for that.
Okay.
So any more thoughts? I was just wondering whether any of this sheds any light on the problem of the mistaken conscience. Because imagining someone scrupulous, so they think they shouldn't do something they should.
Yeah.
And that they have a duty to do, in fact.
Yeah.
But the duty is to do it in good faith, not bad faith. And so it's a second best, but the only second best available to them, not to do something while they think it's wrong.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts about how that might?
Yeah, in fact, a part of the paper talks, you probably know in the Prima Secundae question 19, question 19, articles 5 to 6, he talks about that, and first of all talks about an erroneous conscience, where someone really does think, for instance, that he ought to commit adultery with his brother's wife or something like that, and Thomas asks, well, and in a certain sense, he thinks that conscience is absolutely to be followed there, and in fact, not to follow your conscience would not be good. He would, but so he says that, but then in Article 6, 19.6, he says, but he also says by following that erroneous conscience, he's committing a bad act, and he ought not to do it. And so one of the objections is, well, that leaves a person in a state of perplexity, that he's bound to do something, and yet in doing that he's doing something which is bad. And Thomas's answer there is that, well, no, he's not perplexed, because he can change his conscience, and in other words, make it more consistent with natural law, and in fact with synderesis. So
I wonder whether that's always going to be the case. I mean, imagine that someone's got a duty to act immediately, and their scrupulous conscience tells them not to act. Couldn't you say, well, there's two bad things they shouldn't be doing? They shouldn't be doing the objectively wrong thing, but in good conscience, and they shouldn't be doing the externally right thing, but in bad conscience. There's a third thing they should be doing, but they can't do it because in this split second they don't have time to do the right thing in good conscience, the right external thing in good conscience. And I wonder whether we always have to believe that the answers to very difficult dilemmas are always psychologically available to us. unless we've got some special illumination. I mean, it may be that some things are just a bit hard for us, and no doubt we're mercifully judged on those occasions. But the right way through the dilemma may simply not have occurred to us because it's rather difficult to work out, or we're not very smart.
Yeah, I don't doubt that at all, Helen. And I think you're talking about Synderesis. We're talking about kind of the most basic basic principles of conscience, or and later on, when things are not quite so clear, I do think that Thomas say that if you really do have you think that you ought to do this thing. If you don't do it, in fact, you're doing what you think you ought not to do, and that's not a good situation. But he does hold out the the hope that we can kind of sort these things out. And I don't know. I'm just kind of babbling here.
Yeah, it's a difficult one.
Yeah. But yeah, I don't doubt at all that in a way what I'm doing, I'm in the paper, I'm just trying to explain what Thomas thinks. But
yes.
But the sort of thing you're talking about is kind of more distant from the principle, so you can understand. You have to get into the details of this particular situation and try to sort it out with the person. So
yeah.
Okay.
Any more thoughts? Montana.
Hi, how are you?
Hello, very well, thank you.
I don't have a very deep philosophical background, but I'd want to hear a little bit more about human rights and their relation to conscience.
Okay.
And also any recommended reading from you, Father Kevin, if you could offer any recommended readings that could help me understand better.
Well, in general, kind of the connection between conscience and rights that I was trying to identify is that it's basically the argument. My argument was intended to suggest a way in which kind of a way of proceeding in judging what are rights, what are truly rights, and what are not, even within a particular polity. And I just think that it's because of the objective nature of rights that it's that's an advantage, that we should start there and try to make sure that our system of law doesn't contain contradictory rights. And then, in fact, this is something I didn't actually mention in the talk just now, but I think once you do that, well, then you can turn around and reinterpret those objective rights as subjective rights. And so John, who should have the property, et cetera. So you're talking about kind of an objective situation in the world, which would constitute jus, that is the just. And but it also pertains to John. So John has that right, and has that right to his property. And the one thing. So what that basically is doing is going, well, what I'm doing is kind of starting with objective rights, but then acknowledging that, having established that, then we can talk about subjective rights. It's going in the direction of John Finnis. So John Finnis has no problem with saying that, that there are subjective rights and even subjective rights in Thomas Aquinas, and I don't have any real serious problem with that, but I just think that we ought to say that primarily rights are objective, and then we can try to attach those to individuals and talk about personalistic rights. And so a good book to read would be in fact John Finnis's Natural Law and Natural Rights. It's very, very basic, and in which he talks a good deal about rights there. And besides John, I would just say Thomas Aquinas and the passages that especially the passages where he talks about Synderesis, conscience, those two passages that I just mentioned in the first part of the second part, which would be question 19, articles 5 and 6. And that's I know that when this book comes out, there's going to be a whole lot of other scholars kind of writing about rights. One is Chris Tollefson, who's a colleague of John Finnis's, and he'll be certainly kind of expounding kind of ideas along the lines that John Finnis expounds them. That's about the things that come to mind, Montana. So.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
John Finnis, how do you spell that?
Oh, okay, Finnis, right? Finnis.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
Thank you.
I don't always agree with John, but on this, I do agree.
Father Kevin.
Yeah, Jason.
Yeah, if we still have time, I'll pitch another question. Yeah, kind of along the lines of Montana's question, and also what you were saying in response to Helen. Yeah, I want to just expound a bit on what role public authorities, particularly secular public authorities, obviously the church in its magisterium has an authoritative role in shaping the consciences of the faithful and trying to speak to all people of goodwill to shape their consciences. But as Aristotle says, it's the job of the legislators to train the citizens to be virtuous. They don't always do a good job of that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But it does seem, and I'm thinking in particular here in Dignitatis Humanae, Vatican II Declaration, there's the strong affirmation of the rights of conscience, particularly in religious matters, in paragraph number 5. But then in paragraphs, I think it's 7 and 8, they talk about the proper authority again that political authorities have to limit the expression of conscience for the sake of the common good. And so it seems like, especially as we're, I don't want to concretize this too much, but I was thinking about, vaccine mandates and other public health measures, and people claiming, wanting religious exemptions from those such mandates. How do we, I'd just like to hear your thoughts on how we balance what the right role is of secular public authorities here in maybe restricting expressions of conscience.
And restricting expressions of conscience.
Right. So
okay.
In other words, my ability to act based on my conscience, if again the public authorities deem that's not conducive to the common good, that type of thing.
Yeah. I mean, as you know, there are passages in like Lumen Gentium, et cetera, where the kind of the independent nature of political action is acknowledged, and that is that that it has its own sense, even independently of to some extent independently of the magisterium. So again, given certain limits, and serious limits, like the right to life, et cetera, like that, and let me I must say maybe this will clarify something that I said before. So again, I so very often, kind of fall back on Aristotle, but so, he would acknowledge that, there are certain things that would be just, which in a just way of acting within a democracy, kind of following the rules in a democracy, and that would be different if you were a citizen in a kind of a monarchy, or kind of a system in which kind of there was a kind of kind of a small number of people governing it. And so and he actually talks about also kind of mixed versions of all these things, but his point in the politics is that to be a good citizen is dependent on the way that law is set up in a particular polis, and I think that's true. So I don't think when you do have a government or government authorities that are establishing rules, we don't necessarily have to assume that they're going to be all the same in every state or every kind of political entity, and so there are simple there are sometimes decisions which could go either way, and but once a law is established, well then someone in that particular polis and in that particular state is obliged to follow it, if as long as it's not something which is absolutely crazy and something which contradicts basic rights, and so anyhow, it seems to me that there's a great deal of leeway in that sort of a setup, or kind of that sort of a theory for variation, and a lot, and and it what becomes just depends on the particular people that establish the laws, and as I mean, even Thomas will say that that you may actually have to obey in a particular polity an unjust law if disobeying it will damage the common good. But obviously, it would be better to get rid of that unjust law, but he, it's there's just there's authority there. So
Great, thanks, Father.
okay.
Yes, just on the subject of justice, I was interested what you said about the difference between justice and the other virtues, in that justice seeks the state of affairs. And I was just thinking, how do you think it's different from benevolence? Because benevolence seeks to benefit the other person, but that might not work. So you're trying to secure some benefit for them, but you might be doing it all wrong.
Yeah.
And in the same way, if you're a just judge or a juror, or a police officer or whatever you are trying to seek justice, but that doesn't mean that you will be arriving at the state of affairs that you're trying to achieve. So I wonder, is justice as different as all that from at least virtues like benevolence?
I mean, I'd have to look again at the passage on benevolence, but I'm pretty sure maybe Jason can, or someone else can correct me on this, but is that in benevolence, in fact, you can do more than is actually required. So it's not so much a question of establishing the right, that is equality, et cetera, but actually going beyond what is absolutely required of you, and whether that's connected. You started out by talking about, and it's very interesting that Thomas does follow Aristotle in saying that justice is special because it's not so concerned with the individual or the person as the other virtues. Benevolence, I would imagine, one is virtuous as being benevolent in a personal way. So I mean that has to do with personal characteristics, and Does that
So,
make sense?
so you don't think it's failed benevolence if someone tries to help someone, but it goes completely askew in a way that, you know, perhaps someone else would have known it would. So, so benevolence is completely within the person. So no matter how misguided they are in their attempts to help the person, then
I mean, again, you know, I would kind of fall back on Aristotle and again Thomas's interpretation of Aristotle, and what he says is that it gets kind of complicated, and so he talks about, you know, kind of particular justice. So particular justice would have to do with you know, John and whether he owns this lot, etc. And then he says, well, there's also general justice, and it's actually Aristotle calls it legal justice, but that just causes confusion. But now Thomas tends to talk about general justice, and then he says that Aristotle says that general justice is the same thing in essence with all of virtue. And so what that does is take, and also explicitly about according to Thomas, is that it makes all the virtues, even though they are personalistic, you know, or, you know, kind of subjective, it takes them into the common good. So ultimately they are aimed at, or, you know, they do have the same object as justice. So or at least they come under, so they're not completely subjective. So and he would say things like, you know, like even, you know, kind of private sins that you know, nowadays people would say that, well, okay, so you do this bad thing, but it's not hurting anyone, it's not hurting the common good. I think Thomas would say no, any sort of lack of virtue is going to harm the common good, precisely because we are by nature political animals, and so to come back to the question of benevolence, it does ultimately have some connection with the common good, and so does that help at all? So.
Yes, I'm just wondering though, because given that we're not infallible, you know, when we try and benefit people, you know, we are going to make all sorts of mistakes, and it seems a little harsh if we don't have the virtue of benevolence simply because of our ineptitude of working out what's really going to benefit people.
No, I mean, all along, you know, I've been acknowledging, Helen, is that okay, when you do have these kind of very, you know, kind of delicate and not easily resolvable issues, well then, yeah, it's gonna, you know, it's gonna be tough to decide just exactly what ought to be done. Yeah.
I suppose just sorry, I'll stop speaking soon, but I just thought sometimes there seems to be a point to a virtue that's not attained even when the person's perfectly virtuous. So take the case of someone who's in an invalid marriage and they don't know that.
Sure.
That might be a perfectly virtuous person, but they're not achieving the point of the virtue, which is an actual marriage through no fault of their own. So I'm just thinking maybe there's a sort of a point of seeking justice and a point of seeking benevolence that you don't necessarily attain, you know, even though you're trying your best. And so are in some way a benevolent or a just person, but, you know, you just don't get there. You know, maybe you're a juror, and maybe the criminal's a very good liar, or you know, so you don't attain the end of justice, but you're nonetheless a just person in what you're seeking. But no, that's just a thought anyway. But I'll stop talking.
Okay. It's stuff to think about. Yeah, but again, you know, even like in, you know, like hearing confessions and things like that. I mean, you just as a priest, you just constantly come across issues, questions. Sometimes are extremely ambiguous because the way, you know, that's the question is framed by the person who's in the confessional, but often, you know, the fact is, you know, I as a priest, you know, with minimal information and even as much information as that particular person might have, it can be very difficult to determine what ought to be done, what ought not to be done, et cetera, et cetera. And it often takes a long time, to get to know someone, and over years to find out exactly what ought to be done in any particular situation. And in fact, I'm thinking of situations like, marriages and
Yes.
so, yeah.
Any more thoughts, comments or questions? Nobody? Well, thank you so much, Father Kevin, for giving us so much to think
Okay,
about. And yes, I'm sorry we couldn't have a larger WIP for you, but we did our best to, how these.
Oh, good. No, it's good. It's good to see. It's good to be with all you guys. Yeah.
But no, thank you so much for coming, and we really appreciate it.
Thank you very
Okay.
much.
Okay. See you later. It's good
Thank you,
meeting
Father
you.
Kevin.
Okay.
Thank you.
See you, Jason. Montana. Okay.
Thank
And Matthew. Okay.
you.